Here's something I've heard said of being a nurse. Where else can you experience the thrill of having total strangers poop in front of you like it's totally your business?
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I talk about HAPS awards, preview episodes, my Nuzzel Newsletter, warnings in an A&P syllabus, and safety advice. Some of the topics I discuss and some of the links I provide in the show notes or episode page provide in-depth information regarding recent news or recent research publications. And many of those updates you hear in these podcast episodes first appear in my daily newsletter of curated headlines for A&P teachers. This daily collection of headlines is conveyed through a service called Nuzzel. That's Nuzzel. And the name of my newsletter is easy to remember. It's the same as the name of this podcast, The A&P Professor. To find the archive of past Nuzzel newsletters, or to get it delivered daily in your inbox for free, just go to nuzzel.com, that's nuzzel.com/theapprofessor. Or, you guessed it, just click the link in the show notes or episode page. Marketing support for this podcast is provided by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Hey, check out the newly revised A&P course guidelines at the website. Just go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. You already know that HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, is one of the sponsors of this podcast. If you're familiar with HAPS, you may also know that they give out various awards, travel awards, that can be used to help fund your travel and your participation in the annual HAPS conference, which occurs usually at the end of May every year. And so I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about those awards so that we're all familiar with them. And secondly, I'm going to point out a couple of things that are new to the awards program this year. One thing that's new is that the committee that develops and administers these awards has a slightly different name. It used to be called the Grants and Scholarship Committee. Now it's the Awards and Scholarships Committee, because that reflects a little bit better what we're doing here. And when I say we, I am a member of that committee. I have been for a long time. So I've seen kind of what goes on behind the scenes, and I'll tell you, a lot goes on behind the scenes in terms of trying to develop new awards and also in doing the best job that we can in awarding the various kinds of awards that we have available. So first of all, one of the reasons I'm bringing this up now is that the applications and all the supporting material have a deadline of January 3rd. So this gives you plenty of time before the end of this academic term to get all your ducks in a row. Because January 3rd, that comes usually at a time that's in between semesters. So if you're looking for letters of support and things like that, they're not going to be so easy to get at the last minute like that. So if you work on it now, you'll have plenty of time to prepare. I also want to mention that there are two categories of awards given out by HAPS. One are the supported awards, and what that means is there is some kind of external sponsor who is providing the funds necessary for that award. And I'll go through what those are in a moment. We have a new one this year. And then the other major category of HAPS awards are just called HAPS awards because they're being funded from internal funds, from inside HAPS. So looking at the supported awards, we have three of them. One of them is the AD Instruments Sam Drogo Technology in the Classroom Award. Now, AD Instruments is a company that provides equipment and supplies for teaching human anatomy and physiology, and they've been a longtime supporter of HAPS and its mission. The Sam Drogo part comes from a former member, a deceased member of HAPS named Sam Drogo. Now, I've been around at HAPS for a long, long time, so I've met a lot of people in HAPS, and Sam is one of them. Sam was a friend of mine. He taught up at Mohawk Valley Community College in upstate New York, and he was a great guy, and he contributed a lot to the community of anatomy and physiology teachers. And he was also very well respected by his students and very well loved by his students. And he died suddenly, and when he did, AD Instruments and HAPS and a lot of his friends and students felt like it was appropriate to develop some kind of award or scholarship that would honor his memory. And that's what we have here. The AD Instruments Sam Drogo Technology in the Classroom Award. And that Technology in the Classroom Award refers to the fact that this award encourages the innovative use of technology to engage undergraduates in human anatomy and physiology. And so what you get is $500 to attend the HAPS annual conference, and you're encouraged to present a workshop featuring technology and education innovations at the conference. And so 3 of those awards are available, all sponsored by AD Instruments. But I want to point out, it does not mean you need to use AD Instruments equipment or software as part of your workshop presentation or in your teaching or anything. So they sponsor it, but they're not requiring that you use their product. Another of the supported awards is the Gail Jenkins Teaching and Mentoring Award. And this is supported by the textbook publisher Wiley. Part of the reason that they're supporting it is to honor one of their authors, Gail Jenkins, who also is a deceased member of HAPS. That is, she was a longtime member of HAPS, contributed a lot, served a lot of different roles within HAPS, and became a friend to many, including me, within HAPS. I learned a lot from Gail, and I really appreciate her friendship and her support over the years. So I'm glad that Wiley was able to fund this award in her name, and that is the Gail Jenkins Teaching and Mentoring Award. It's an annual award for a HAPS member who demonstrates use of engaging learning activities to help students truly understand and retain the more difficult anatomy and physiology concepts with kinesthetic and active learning strategies using inexpensive everyday props. This was something that was very dear to Gail's heart. The award is also designed to recognize those willing to mentor other instructors, to also incorporate active learning to benefit even more students. So this award is a $1,000 cash award provided by Wiley, and the registration is waived for the HAPS annual conference in May. Award recipients will be required to present a workshop at the annual conference. The third of the supported awards I want to mention is a new one. We've never offered this before. This is the John Martin Second Timer Award. And yes, I know John Martin. John Martin is still alive and kicking, and I just saw him at the last conference. He hadn't been to a few conferences since his retirement, and I was glad to see him there and visit with him. And he's been part of HAPS since the very beginning. And this award that's new this year is funded by him, a former A&P teacher. And it's open to high school faculty in addition to college and university faculty. And this award is for HAPS members who have attended only one previous HAPS annual conference. That's why we call it a Second Timer Award. So you've attended only one previous HAPS annual conference, and it doesn't matter which year, as long as it was an annual conference. And you're in need of some financial assistance to attend this year's conference as a second timer. So the award is $500 to use toward attending the HAPS annual conference, and applicants must be full-time or contingent college, university faculty, or full-time high school faculty currently teaching anatomy and physiology, with at least part of the teaching load being face-to-face, as opposed to totally online teaching. Now, award recipients will be required to present either a poster or a workshop at the annual conference. So that's the John Martin Second Timer Award. very first time we're offering that award. And thanks again to John Martin for providing that. Thanks to Wiley for providing the Gail Jenkins Teaching and Mentoring Award. And thanks to AD Instruments for sponsoring the AD Instruments Sam Drogo Technology in the Classroom Award. And now the internal HAPS awards that come out of HAPS funds all pay the registration fee for the next annual conference, plus $400 to help with travel expenses to attend the conference. And all of them require award recipients to make a presentation at the 2020 HAPS annual conference. And they require a completion of an online application plus submission of one letter of recommendation separate from the application. And these include the Robert B. Anthony Travel Award. Now, Robert B. Anthony is, well, I think of him as the guy who invented HAPS in a way. It was his idea and implementation of some initial workshops up at Triton College in Illinois, where he invited A&P professors from all over the place to come for a few days and share with each other tips and insights in teaching A&P, and he would bring in other experts and so on as well. That eventually evolved into HAPS as an organization. Bob Anthony continued to be a very active member of HAPS for many, many years after that. He's now retired from teaching and is no longer active in HAPS, but he was one of our early presidents, and he served a variety of other roles, and a lot of them informal roles in counseling the presidents and being generally supportive of what was going on in the organization. So that's the Robert B. Anthony Travel Award, and that was one of the first awards ever established by HAPS. Another one is the Full-Time Faculty Travel Award to encourage full-time faculty with more than 5 years of teaching anatomy and physiology to attend the HAPS annual conference. Another one, a third one, is the Contingent Faculty Travel Award to encourage contingent faculty. And there's a definition at the website if you're not sure what they mean by contingent, because there's lots of different flavors of that. And then the fourth one is the Student/Postdoc Travel Award. And what's new this year about that is it's now open to undergraduate students as well as to grad students and postdocs. So what I suggest you do is go to the approfessor.org/HAPS and look for those awards and page through it and start to get your ducks in a row so that you can apply for these and see if you can't get some support for coming to our next annual conference. And it's this year it's going to be in Ottawa, Canada, and it's shaping up to be another really great conference. A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy. Did you know that HAPS members qualify for a reduced membership rate in AAA? Check it out at anatomy.org. I want to take just a moment to talk about preview episodes. Preview episodes are episodes that are released a few days before a full episode. You're listening to a full episode right now, and a few days before this was released, I released a preview episode that goes hand in hand with the full episode. And if you've never heard a preview episode, you might think that it's just sort of a listing of topics or maybe clips from the full episode. And, well, you'd be partially right. I do list the topics, but I literally only take a minute, maybe 2 minutes, to run down what the topics are going to be in the full episode. So, yeah, you do get that kind of preview. But there are additional segments that have additional content that may be helpful in the full episode or just helpful in general. For example, I nearly always do a word dissection, where I take terms that are going to be used in the full episode, mostly terms that have sort of odd constructions, and most often they're terms that we don't necessarily use in teaching A&P all the time, and they might even be newly coined terms that maybe you want to be familiar with so that you're kind of ahead of the game. And so that's what we do in word dissection. It's that same sort of thing that we all do when we're teaching our class, where we break down big terms into their word parts so that we can understand them more deeply. So we have that word dissection segment. There's also almost always a book club segment. And this is where the AP Professor Book Club will give a recommendation for some book that is helpful or interesting to people who teach A&P. And some of those are recommendations from my own reading, my own library of books that have helped me as an A&P teacher, and a lot of them are sent in by listeners. It's their favorite books, their books that they think really have helped informed or support their teaching of A&P. And occasionally there are announcements and other kinds of content mixed in there as well. So if you're not familiar with the previews, I want to encourage you to try them out. And I don't want you to miss out on the news, opinions, or content that you'll benefit from hearing in those previews. In some past episodes, I've referred to things that I've put into my course syllabus and other course documents. For example, episode 24, titled The Syllabus Episode, had a whole bunch of them. More recently, I mentioned that I explained my spelling policy, or I should say my misspelling policy, in my course documents. Well, since I've been thinking about these things, I thought I'd share some warnings that I put into my syllabus in a special section called, it's called Warnings, with an exclamation point. These are things that I want to get out there and get students thinking about right away. I talk about these too, but I like to have them in my syllabus because I want them available to students all the time. And putting them in the syllabus emphasizes that they're important, right? I put a handout with these syllabus warnings in the mobile app, which I call the TAP app. So you can read along if you want. Just pause this audio, open up the handout in the app, and then resume the audio. By the way, if you want to know more about the TAP app, then check out the preview episode that precedes this full episode. So moving on here. To help distinguish what I actually put in my syllabus from my general discussing of things in this segment, I'll put some mood music under the passages I'm reading from my syllabus so you know that I'm reading from my syllabus when you hear the music. Okay, here's the first of my 3 warnings. This course is about the human body. There will be graphic images and frank descriptions and discussions of body parts and body functions. This means nudity. In the images, not in class, silly. Discussions of sex, urine and urination, feces and defecation, spitting, sneezing, snoring, farting, vomiting, snot, blood, guts, and generally gross or embarrassing stuff that you may find uncomfortable. If you think you shouldn't be exposed to any of this stuff, then now's the time to make the decision to leave or stay in the course, and perhaps rethink your proposed career choice. And this is one of the reasons that children are not allowed in the classrooms or labs. Their giggling gets distracting. Okay, so that's the first of 3 warnings. And notice that this is not written in dry, humorless prose. It's that kind of lighthearted, kind of goofy, borderline snarky voice that you hear me use all the time in this podcast, right? Why do I do that in my list of warnings? Well, mainly because that's just who I am. But being kind of lighthearted and goofy kind of takes the edge off a bit, so that it's coming across more as advice from a friendly, maybe even goofy, source. And it makes the content a bit easier to open up to. Before I forget, I want to mention that reference to kids in classrooms and labs. I'm on Twitter and other social platforms, so I do see all the kudos given to teachers who bring their kids to class, or let students bring kids to class, or even hold a student's baby, presumably with permission, while they're lecturing. Yep, those sure are endearing moments. And yeah, I've let kids, even babies, into class before, even my own kids. I can't say that I've rocked any of these kids to sleep as I taught a class, though. But I don't do that anymore for a number of reasons. First of all, some colleges I've worked at have a strict policy against this. I've been told it's mostly about liability related to kids being injured, or if there's a fire or campus shooter or other catastrophe. But I think some of the other reasons I'll cite here come into play as well in formulating those college policies. So another reason I now bar children from being in the classroom or lab is my own concern for their safety. This is a professional environment where I'm expecting everyone to play it safe. I can't expect that of children. So that means I can't concentrate on doing my job properly if I'm not responsible for the safety of children whose parent may or not be attending to them sufficiently because, well, maybe they just don't realize the dangers like I do. Or maybe they're just so swept up in the enthralling class that they forget about watching their kids for a moment. Which leads to another issue. Having kids in the classroom, no matter how quiet and well-behaved they are a distraction. A lot of students won't say anything for fear of being judged. In other words, they're not going to say, hey, I don't want this other student to bring their kids in, especially when that other student and those kids are sitting right there. It's just like I risk being judged right now for being against professors cuddling students' offspring while lecturing. But believe me, I hear from them outside of class, sometimes arriving to my office en masse with torches and pitchforks. Okay, maybe not that well armed, but certainly not happy about the disruptions. And then there's the reason cited here. Having kids in a class means that there's some subjects I have to remember to step softly around in a way that I wouldn't with all adults in the classroom. And sometimes I forget to step softly or don't realize I should step softly, and now I'm potentially a bad actor in this scene without intending to be. My A&P class is for adults who can pay attention to what we're doing and can watch out for their own safety. It's just not a place for kids. All that being said, I know that sometimes getting childcare is more than challenging. So I do what I can to help students work out alternative solutions. So I don't advise a lack of empathy or a lack of compassion. I encourage us all to be supportive. But bringing kids into class is not a good solution, in my opinion. You know, sometimes even adults are uncomfortable in an A&P class because some of what we talk about really is taboo in polite social conversation. So when these topics that we're not used to discussing come up in class, they can make us a bit uncomfortable, even if we're prepared for it, and even if we see the point in discussing them. It's the influence of our culture, and we can't just pretend it's not there. So I bring this up partly to acknowledge it before it happens, which I think kind of makes it, a little bit easier to ease into when the moment does arrive in class. Another reason I do this is because my students are mostly going into health professions, where they'll regularly be put in a position of discussing and possibly even putting gloves on and getting up close to things that most people won't even discuss in public. And if a patient is hesitant to talk about their bowel habits or other unmentionable functions with a stranger, even if it's medically necessary, just think how much more reluctant to discuss their symptoms with someone who's clearly embarrassed to be hearing about it. So I have a discussion about that discomfort and tell them that I had to get used to it as a teacher. I'm not sure I'm completely used to it sometimes, and that they ought to start working on getting used to it too, ahead of time, before they're dealing with patients. This reminds me of something that happened not too far along in my teaching career. I had noticed that in A&P2, near the end when we're talking about the reproductive system. Most of those students I had had for 2 semesters, in A&P1 and now in A&P2, and A&P2 was coming to a close. And so we had reached a pretty high level of comfort with each other. And I noticed that when I got to the reproductive system, suddenly when, if I was giving a little mini lecture or something like that, I would look out in class and, all these students that would normally be looking at me, jotting a few notes, were now entirely looking down at their notebook and not looking up, not making eye contact, certainly. And I was amused by that when I first saw it. And of course, I understand why that's the case, because reproductive function is one of those taboo subjects that not everyone is comfortable with discussing in public. And I wasn't a stranger at that point, but I still was not a close friend or family member. And even then, I think a lot of people have some difficulty in having those kinds of discussions. The next time around, when that came to be, I revisited that discomfort discussion right before we started talking about the reproductive system. And I said, hey, I've noticed this happen before in class. And so I'm just pointing out that, we need to think about the way we react to things, because when we're dealing with patients and they're telling us about their symptoms, we don't want to be looking down, looking away, not making eye contact, because that's going to make them even more uncomfortable and even less likely to give us accurate information that we need in order to take care of them. And so I didn't really think much of that. And so I start my story of the reproductive system. And I'm, walking around and making gestures and doing what I normally do during a lecture. And I look out at the classroom and I see everybody, every single student is making eye contact with me, which that never happened either. But then I just started laughing and they said, what? And I said, oh my gosh, I've never mentioned this, phenomenon before to students, and I didn't realize the effect it was going to have. Now you're all trying to make eye contact with me because, you don't want to be one of the students that are just staring down at their notebook the whole time, too embarrassed to look up. And so, yeah, this can have unintended consequences when you have these discussions about the kinds of things that you're talking about in class. So be aware. Okay, so finally, I'm ready to go on to warning number 2 from my syllabus. This course takes a lot of time, a lot more than other courses. Well, except maybe calculus and perhaps some of the nursing courses. A lot more than you might think. A lot more. Carefully consider your overall time and energy commitments. Do you have family to take care of? Do you have a job? Does it demand a lot of time, or will your schedule change suddenly? Are there other major stressors in your life right now? Do you realize that some college work is not like high school? It takes a lot of time. Carefully consider arranging your schedule to allow for this course. And if you aren't willing to take the needed time outside of class, or if you think you may not be able to take the time, then now is when you should consider carefully whether you should take the course now or at a different time in your life. Now, way back in episode 9, where I gave advice for helping returning learners, I talked about a technique that can work well with both returning learners and traditional learners. And that is to have them sit down and have a chat with their family, friends, coworkers, teammates, and other folks in their lives, and let them know that they're being asked to be part of a team that's going to help the student make it to their goals, to give them some extra space and possibly some extra support. Because let's face it, A&P is hard. And those next courses after A&P aren't really going to be a piece of cake either. Back in episode 55, I suggested that we avoid typing anything in all caps in our syllabus. Why? Because all caps is often interpreted as shouting. And maybe we don't want to be shouting at students in our syllabus. But I also mentioned that, well, like anything I declare as a general policy, I sometimes do use all caps in my syllabus. Here's a case in point. When I stated, quote, a lot of them, unquote, in the passage that I just read from the syllabus, The word lot is in all caps. I'm hoping that this will be read as a playful or ironic sort of shouting, and not an angry sort of shouting. But it is something we ought to weigh carefully when we use all caps in any of our communications with students, including the syllabus. Now here's the third warning that I put into my syllabus. Do you realize that there is a major computer/internet component to this course? You need to plan for what computer you will use, including internet connection, and when you will use it. You'll be using it a lot in this course. If you think computer access will be a problem, then you may want to hold off on taking this course until you have personal computer access or can take the time to do your work on campus using our campus computers. Yep, I put the word lot in all caps in this passage too. Okay, maybe I was shouting a bit, but, well, students need to know that even though this particular course, the one I took these warnings from, is considered an ordinary face-to-face course, not an online course, not a hybrid course, not a crossbreed, not an outcross, not an in-cross course, and yet there's all these things a student has to do online, like online practice tests, and some online regular tests, and accessing grades, and interactive videos, and stuff like that. A lot of us who spend year after year teaching know this about our classes. But a lot of students, especially those just entering college, and among those especially returning learners, aren't often aware of that. Yes, even now that we're 2 decades into the 21st century, they are just not aware of it sometimes. So it's important to emphasize this issue so it doesn't suddenly become a big obstacle when the first online test is due. Okay, that's a lot to take in all at once. But I'll be diving back into my syllabus more in this and in future episodes. And I invite you to do the same. What are some things that have worked for you? Just call or write in and we'll share them, okay? And if you want to come on this show and chat about it, that would be even better. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction, the HAPI degree. I'm on the faculty of this program, so I know the incredible value it is for A&P teachers. Looking to power up your game in teaching A&P? Check out this online graduate program at nycc.edu/HAPI, that's HAPI, or click the link in the show notes or episode page. In another segment, I talked about my 3 warnings to students that I put into my course syllabus. Now I'm going to tell you about the safety advice I give them too. Now I'm all about safety. I think I got that from my early days spent as a zookeeper and then as a wild animal trainer. You just don't survive without a limp and a bunch of scars or survive at all in those professions unless safety comes first. Even with safety precautions, a cage full of lions and a lab full of chemicals and sharp instruments can still produce injuries, scars, or worse. And it's not just the lab-specific stuff that's dangerous. There are all kinds of hazards that we as teachers ought to be prepared for, and that we ought to prepare our students for. There's fires, earthquakes, deranged people with military-style assault weapons, medical incidents, all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to run through a sheet of safety advice that I give my students, sometimes as part of the handout or sometimes as a separate sheet along with the syllabus, just to throw out some ideas and get you thinking about ways that you might want to handle safety. To make it easy to tell which parts I actually list in my syllabus or safety sheet, I'll put music under the parts I'm quoting. There's also a printed version in the app, that is the TAP app. That's the free app for listening to this podcast that I talked about in the preview to this episode. Both here and in the handout in the app, I've dropped the school name and other specific info and inserted just a generic phrase instead. So, in parts it sounds kind of wonky for that reason. Now these are all numbered items. Item 1. always play it safe. If there's anything at all that seems like it may be a safety hazard, strange smells, strange sounds, finding strange objects, suspicious behavior of a classmate, and so on, then inform the instructor immediately, even if it means interrupting the lecture or discussion. Number 2, keep the school name, Department of Public Safety, phone number handy. It is phone number. Put it into your smartphone's contact/favorite list now. Also, write it down on the front of your notebook now. Sign up for the free emergency alert system, text messaging, at URL. Now notice how I inserted the phrases school name and URL and so on. There are other substitutions that you might want to make. For example, your school may not have something called Department of Public Safety, and your school system may be called something different than Emergency Alert System. And I'll admit it, there are a couple of words here that are in all caps, which we know can be heard as shouting, and I've advised not to use that in your syllabus or anytime you give student instructions, but, well, as always, I don't necessarily follow all my own rules all the time. So when I said to put the safety number in your smartphone now is in all caps. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of shouting that. So I'm using it for emphasis when it could be taken as shouting, but you know what? It's okay if they hear it as shouting, because I think they're hearing the concern where it's coming from rather than me trying to kind of get down on them. Number 3, in case of fire, evacuate the building. There's a map at the door of this room. Study it today and know where you are going if evacuation is necessary later in the semester. Know at least 2 ways of getting out of the building. There are fire alarms and fire hoses and fire extinguishers in the hallway. Learn where they are. Number 4, in case of evacuation notice, use the same route as in number 3 above. Number 5, check in with the instructor if an evacuation occurs, even if you don't plan to return to the building. That's so that I won't send emergency staff into a burning building looking for you when you're on your way home. Now, I tell my students that they're risking the lives of emergency workers if they think you're stuck in a burning building, and here you are in the drive-thru at White Castle, which is right across the street from campus. Now, I always have a class roster handy and grab that on the way out if I can. It's not a perfect system for tracking the students who may or may not be in class, but it's better than relying totally on memory, especially my memory. Number 6, in the case of a shooter or similar hazard in the building and safe evacuation is not possible, lock the classroom door from the inside and hide away from the door window. DPS officers will have a key, so do not open for anyone. And consider DHS guidelines. Now, that DHS guidelines thing is a live hyperlink to a PDF that the Department of Homeland Security puts out specifically for this purpose. I'll have a link in the show notes and episode guide, and of course it's in the handout that I have available in the free TAP app. Which reminds me of another bit of advice. Once you have your safety tips all plotted out, make sure you run it by someone in authority on your campus, maybe more than one person, to make sure that your advice is not in conflict with official policy. For example, I'll never forget evacuating a lecture hall of 150 or so students when the fire alarm went off, and we were all out standing on a busy, rainy city street while no one else in that crowded multi-story building evacuated. It was just us standing out there. We eventually went back in, and after class I contacted the emergency department, who told me that they never evacuate for a fire alarm because, well, it's usually not a fire. And so I asked them, well, if it is a fire, then what? And they said, well, then we'll send somebody around yelling fire. I just thought, is that how we're using our technology, really? I mean, why do we even have a fire alarm? So they were kind of annoyed at my call and asked why I didn't read the emergency handbook that was on my desk. And I explained I didn't have a desk because I was an adjunct and nobody ever gave me a handbook and nobody ever mentioned one. So later I asked around to the full-timers and none of them had one either. But the person I was talking to said I should have sought one out and read it, which I thought to myself would be odd to have occurred because I didn't know such a thing even existed. So why would I ask for one? Oh well, so I'm telling you this story for two reasons. One is, well, I'm an old guy, and as I'm sure I've mentioned, stop me if you've heard me say this, when your brain ages, your storytelling inhibitions become increasingly diminished. So that's why I'm telling this story. Another reason I'm telling this story is that, well, things about how colleges and universities are run don't always make sense. Yet, I'm still responsible for the safety of my students. So it pays to ask around for advice and, well, while you're at it, why not ask if there's some sort of handbook that you're supposed to know about? Number 7. In the case of a weather emergency, proceed to a room marked with a blue triangle, usually a lower inside room with no windows. Number 8. In the case of an earthquake, hold on. Get under a table if you can, or on the floor next to a solid object, and watch for flying objects, protecting your head as best you can. Now this reminds me of a story, and as you know, if I think of a story, I'm going to tell it. I was teaching a course in a big lecture hall that held, about 150 or so students. I actually, it was the same lecture hall I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And when I got to my safety advice about earthquakes, I said, looking around, it was, regular lecture hall style seating. So they had these like little flip top desk things that they pulled out, after they sat down. And it would really be quite a feat to try and get underneath one of those. The seats were so close together that would be difficult too. So I said, in a room like this, probably the best thing to do is just get down on the floor, in between, your seat and the seat in front of you. Because if the ceiling or other things come crashing down, then hopefully the seat backs, which will be higher than you, will be able to support the weight of some of those things falling down on you. And that will give you some extra safety. That's much better than staying seated and sitting upright or standing up. So, I kind of thought to myself, is that really the best we can do? And I could see by the look in my student's face, like, yeah, sure, that's going to help a lot. Interestingly, there was one semester I was always had the first class in the morning. It was an 8 a.m. class. And I would go to the lecture hall and go in there and make sure everything was where it was supposed to be. And I had an intercom PA system that I used, so I got that all set up and got all my materials set up and so on, so that when I came to class, I could be greeting students as they arrived and chatting with them and didn't have to worry about getting things set up. So I remember one morning I had walked in, or actually I just kind of looked in the room because the door was locked, and normally the public safety officers had unlocked it for me. So that I could get in there. And so it was locked up. And I thought, well, that's really weird. I'm going to have to go find somebody with a key to open this up because I didn't have a key to that lecture hall.